Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Rick Lansing's disappearance had sent waves of speculation through Port Charles, but for Ava Jerome, Christina Corinthos Davis, and Alexis Davis, there was no mystery. They believed they had neutralized him permanently. Locked away in the suffocating darkness of a basement, gagged and bound, Rick had been reduced to nothing more than a pawn in their desperate bid to maintain control. His voice silenced, his presence erased. They felt confident that no one would dare search beneath the carefully constructed facade they had built. Yet, unbeknownst to them, Elizabeth Baldwin was watching with quiet persistence, piecing together inconsistencies that others brushed aside. Elizabeth's instincts had always been sharp, particularly when it came to those she cared about, and Rick's sudden disappearance gnawed at her. His unresolved legal cases, his abrupt absence from clients who depended on him, and the awkward silences that fell whenever his name was mentioned all combined into a web of suspicion. She began noticing the hushed conversations between Ava, Christina, and Alexis, the glances they exchanged when certain subjects arose, and the unusual way they avoided speaking of Rick in public. Each detail alone might have been dismissed, but together they painted a troubling picture that Elizabeth could not ignore. One evening, driven by intuition, Elizabeth followed Alexis discreetly, careful to stay in the shadows. Her heart pounded when she stumbled upon Rick's car, abandoned in a desolate warehouse, a place no one had any reason to visit. Dust and cobwebs covered the entrance, but faint signs of activity betrayed their attempts to keep it hidden. Elizabeth's suspicions solidified into certainty, and she knew she had to press forward, no matter the danger. Finding the concealed passage leading down to a basement, she descended slowly, the air thick with mildew and dread, until she reached the room where Rick lay bound and gagged. The sight of him, broken but still alive, struck her like a blow. Her chest tightened with both relief and sorrow, yet she moved quickly, methodically loosening his restraints. Rick's eyes, wide with desperation, met hers in a silent plea that cut straight to her soul. There was no time for words, no chance to explain. Every second mattered. She guided him out with careful urgency, navigating the labyrinthine corridors until they emerged into the cool night. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rick could breathe freely, though his body still trembled from the ordeal. Elizabeth's choice afterward was the most dangerous of all. Instead of rushing to the authorities, she chose secrecy. She understood that Rick's enemies would stop at nothing to silence him again, and exposure would only paint a target on his back. By keeping his survival hidden, she could manipulate the narrative, allowing Ava, Christina, and Alexis to continue believing he was dead. In their arrogance, they would lower their guard, and that false sense of security gave Elizabeth and Rick the upper hand. The burden of secrecy weighed heavily on Elizabeth, but it also granted her leverage she had never imagined wielding. With every whispered threat, every cryptic look, she made Ava feel the walls closing in. Ava's confidence, once so unshakable, began to crack under Elizabeth's quiet but relentless pressure. She sensed that Liz knew more than she was saying, and the fear of exposure began to erode her composure. Elizabeth, though haunted by the danger of her own game, pressed on, calculating each move with precision. Meanwhile, Rick's fury simmered beneath the surface. His captivity had left scars that went beyond the physical. Every moment of humiliation, every taunt, every strike of Ava's hand had etched itself into his memory, fueling a thirst for revenge that burned hotter with each passing day. Though Elizabeth counseled patience, urging him to rebuild and regain his strength, Rick's heart was set on retribution. To him, his death was a weapon, one he could use to return as a phantom of vengeance, catching his captors unprepared and destroying the fragile world they had built. For Molly and the rest of the Lansing Davis family, Rick's presumed death was a tragedy that reopened old wounds. Molly's grief was raw and unrelenting, her anger directed at the world for stealing away the man she still loved as an uncle. That grief, however, was part of the very illusion Elizabeth had woven, a painful cost she silently bore in order to maintain the upper hand. When the truth inevitably surfaced, it would fracture relationships and unleash storms of betrayal, but for now, Elizabeth kept her silence, convinced it was the only way to protect Rick until the moment was right. In the shadows of Port Charles, a dangerous game had begun. Elizabeth, once merely a healer and nurturer, had stepped into a role she never sought but could no longer avoid. She was the keeper of secrets, the silent manipulator, and the protector of a man determined to rise from the ashes of captivity. Ava, Alexis, and Christina believed they had buried Rick forever, but what they did not know was that the man they had discarded as dead was very much alive, and with Elizabeth by his side. He was preparing to return it as a victim, but as a reckoning. Would Rick's return bring justice, or would his hunger for revenge consume them all? Would Elizabeth's dangerous gamble secure their survival, or would it plunge her into the same darkness she sought to defeat? The answers remained hidden in the silence of the night, waiting for the moment when Rick Lansing would step back into the light and reclaim the power that had been stolen from him. While the citizens of Port Charles mourned Rick Lansing as if he were truly gone, and while Molly carried the unbearable grief of believing her beloved uncle had perished, Elizabeth Baldwin quietly held the single most dangerous truth. Rick was alive. That knowledge transformed her life, elevating her from a bystander into a central force in a deadly game of survival and power. It was a truth that came with weight, but also with a unique leverage, an invisible weapon she could wield in ways no one expected. Where others saw her as the gentle nurse, Liz began to emerge as something far more formidable, a manipulator in her own right, someone capable of bending the game to her will. For Ava Jerome, the illusion of victory had given her a sense of security. She believed she had eradicated a problem, silenced a man who knew too much, and closed the door on a dangerous chapter. Yet as Liz began to reappear with cryptic stares, casual remarks laced with veiled meanings, and an unsettling calm that hinted at buried knowledge, Ava's poise began to fracture. Elizabeth never confronted her directly, never declared her knowledge aloud, but the subtle weight of her presence was enough. Ava started second-guessing herself, scrutinizing every detail of her plan, and wondering if Elizabeth had somehow uncovered the truth she thought was buried with Rick. Liz fed that paranoia deliberately. She did not need to shout threats. Instead, she crafted an atmosphere of quiet intimidation. An offhand comment about abandoned warehouses, a knowing smile when Rick's name surfaced, or a passing remark about people not always staying dead. All these little hints gnawed at Ava's composure. Liz's new role as silent tormentor forced Ava into submission without a single explicit ultimatum. What terrified Ava the most was the ambiguity, not knowing exactly how much Elizabeth knew, or how far she was willing to go with it. Rick, hidden away under Liz's protection, was no longer the same man who had been dragged into that basement weeks before. His body bore the bruises of captivity, and his mind carried the weight of humiliation and rage. The time he spent bound, gagged, and subjected to Ava's cruelty left him with a searing thirst for revenge. Elizabeth tried to soothe him, reminding him of the dangers that vengeance could bring, urging him to focus on survival. But Rick was not listening. To him, his supposed death had become an opportunity. He could return as a phantom, strike when no one expected it, and devastate those who thought they had triumphed. The psychology of his return would be as destructive as any physical act of violence. Ava, who prided herself on always staying one step ahead, would be blindsided by the reappearance of a man she had already written off. To her enemies and allies alike, Rick's presence would prove that she had failed, that she was vulnerable, and that the control she tried so hard to maintain was nothing more than a fragile illusion. For Molly, the emotional whiplash of grieving her uncle only to see him alive again would shake her to the core. And for Alexis and Christina, Rick's resurrection would raise the stakes beyond anything they could manage, exposing their roles in his captivity and making them complicit in crimes they had desperately tried to keep hidden. Elizabeth's gamble in keeping Rick's survival secret granted her more than just leverage over Ava. It gave her control over the timing of the chaos. She alone held the power to decide when the illusion would shatter, when Rick would step back into Port Charles and reveal himself, and how devastating the impact would be. She had transformed herself into a shadowy figure in the drama, controlling both the living ghost she saved and the trembling woman she now manipulated. As Rick's anger continued to build, the prospect of his revenge loomed larger. He envisioned himself emerging suddenly in public, disrupting Ava's carefully maintained image, and dismantling the lies she used to hold others in her orbit. Every detail of his captivity, the smell of the basement, the sting of Ava's blows, the indignity of being silenced ardent his resolve. His return would not be quiet. It would be a reckoning, a spectacle designed to destroy the woman who tried to erase him. Ava, who once believed she had written the final chapter of Rick's story, was now trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty. The knowledge that Rick could expose her at any time and that Elizabeth seemed to control the narrative reduced her once fearless bravado to desperation. For the first time in years, she was not the one holding all the cards. And in that shift, Elizabeth Baldwin revealed herself to be more than a caretaker or healer. She became the architect of a new balance of power, one in which secrets were currency and fear was the most valuable weapon of all. Rick's looming reemergence promised to reshape Port Charles forever. But the one constant was clear. Nothing and no one would ever look at Elizabeth or at Ava the same way again once the truth came crashing to the surface. Molly Lansing Davis had always prided herself on being resilient, but the grief she endured after Rick's supposed death nearly broke her. To her, Rick had not just been in and Clea was a protector, an anchor, a complicated but constant figure who had always been there when she needed him. His sudden disappearance and the belief that he had been taken from her forever left Molly trapped in a spiral of sorrow that she could not escape. She withdrew from her friends, avoided family gatherings where his absence would be too painfully obvious, and poured herself into work and distractions that offered little relief. Yet the most devastating truth was not Rick's presumed death itself, but that the very people she trusted most were shaping her grief into a lie. Elizabeth Baldwin had saved Rick, had hidden him away, and yet had chosen silence over honesty. Elizabeth's decision weighed heavily on her every moment of the day. She told herself that keeping Rick's survival a secret was the only way to protect him from those who wanted him destroyed. She rationalized that the deception bought him time to recover and plot his next move. Yet each time she saw Molly's tear-streaked face or heard her speak about Rick with aching finality, Elizabeth felt the crushing guilt of betrayal pressing down on her. Every day that passed made her complicit not only in Rick's survival but in Molly's anguish, and she knew that when the truth eventually surfaced, the fallout would be catastrophic. The Lansing Davis family had never been a model of unity. They carried years of fractured trust, painful betrayals, and volatile dynamics. But Rick's presumed death had briefly united them in grief, allowing them to mourn together. Elizabeth's silence, however, was a hidden fracture line running beneath that fragile unity, waiting for the moment to tear it apart. Molly, who valued truth above all else, would never forgive Elizabeth for letting her suffer unnecessarily. Alexis, who had her own tangled role in Rick's disappearance, would feel exposed and humiliated by Liz's manipulation of the situation. Christina, already drowning in guilt for her complicity in Rick's captivity, would be pushed to her breaking point once Molly realized just how deep her sister's betrayal ran. Meanwhile, Ava Jeremy, woman who once stood at the center of power and intrigue, was becoming more unstable with each passing day. Elizabeth's careful but relentless pressure was eroding Ava's confidence, turning her into a shadow of the formidable schemer she had once been. Liz had mastered the art of weaponizing silence and suggestion. A knowing glance, a pause too long when Rick's name came up, a casual comment about secrets never staying buried, all of it sent Ava spiraling into paranoia. She no longer knew how much Elizabeth truly knew, or whether she could contain it. For someone like Ava, who thrived on control, that uncertainty was unbearable. Elizabeth had, almost without realizing it, stepped into the role of puppeteer. She did not need to blackmail Ava directly. Her subtle reminders were enough to control her. Ava became increasingly cautious, her every decision clouded by the fear that Elizabeth might at any moment expose her crimes. Liz now held Ava on invisible strings, pulling them whenever she wanted to assert dominance. The tables had turned so completely that the manipulator had become the manipulated. Ava's world, once governed by her schemes, was now dictated by Liz's silent power. Rick, hidden away and nursing his rage, watched this transformation with both eyes and ease. He had seen Elizabeth as a healer, a woman of compassion, someone who had saved his life when no one else would. But now, in the aftermath of his captivity, he saw another side of her emerging, darker, sharper, more calculating. She was no longer simply protecting him, she was reshaping the very balance of power in Port Charles. Rick's fury at Ava and those who had conspired against him grew stronger each day, and Elizabeth's silence gave him the luxury of plotting his revenge from the shadows. To the world, Rick Lansing was gone. But to Rick himself, that false death was an opportunity to return as something more terrifying than before, a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from vengeance. The consequences of Elizabeth's secrecy stretched far beyond Ava's paranoia and Rick's plans. Molly's grief was not just sorrow, it was the creation of a wound that would one day burst open with fury. Once Molly learned that Rick had been alive all along, and that Elizabeth had let her suffer in ignorance, it would irreparably damage their bond. The anger, the sense of betrayal, the humiliation of being deceived by someone she trusted, it would shake Molly to her core. The Lansing Davis family, already fragile, might not withstand the explosion of emotions and accusations that would follow. Old resentments would resurface, hidden grudges would be given new life, and the already fragile ties of loyalty would be severed completely. Elizabeth, in her attempt to save Rick and outmaneuver Ava, had placed herself at the center of a storm. She had become the keeper of secrets, the manipulator of emotions, and the architect of a new, dangerous order. But with that role came consequences she could not yet predict. Her choices had turned Molly into a victim of betrayal, Rick into a weapon of vengeance, and Ava into a puppet dancing on strings of fear. What began as an act of compassion saving a man's life had evolved into a tangled web of control, deceit, and looming destruction. Sooner or later, the truth would surface. When it did, it would not simply reveal Rick's survival. It would unravel the delicate web of lies Elizabeth had spun, expose Ava's crimes to the light, and destroy whatever fragile bonds still held the Lansing Davis family together. Port Charles would be rocked to its core, and Elizabeth, once a nurse who devoted her life to healing, would be revealed as the woman who tore apart families and redefined power with nothing more than silence and secrets. In the swirling chaos that now surrounded Port Charles, Rick Lansing's very existence had become the greatest uncertainty of all. His survival was not simply a twist of fate but a looming force that could tip the balance of power in any direction. Every breath he took in hiding was another second closer to a reckoning, for the choices before him were stark and unforgiving. On one hand, Elizabeth Baldwin pleaded for restraint, urging him to take this second chance as an opportunity to rebuild, to reclaim his life quietly and step away from the endless cycle of betrayal and revenge. She envisioned a future where Rick could live without shadows, where his survival was not a weapon but a rebirth. Yet, on the other hand, Rick's heart throbbed with the memory of chains, humiliation, and Ava Jerum's cruel dominance. To him, silence felt like surrender, and surrender was something he could no longer endure. Every moment in captivity had been etched into his mind with merciless precision. He could still feel the bite of ropes against his wrists, the suffocating taste of the gag, the mocking words of his captors, and the brutal finality in Ava's eyes when she believed she had crushed him completely. Those wounds did not fade with freedom, they deepened with time, festering until they became the very fuel that sustained him. Elizabeth's voice, calm and rational, tried to cut through the noise, but Rick could not shake the burning need to make Ava pay. His desire for vengeance was not just about reclaiming dignity, it was about showing everyone that no matter how carefully secrets were buried, they would always claw their way to the surface. The reality of Rick being alive was more than just personal. It was a volatile truth that functioned like a ticking bomb beneath the fabric of Port Charles. Ava, Alexis, and Christina had built their security on the assumption that Rick was gone, that their sins were buried alongside him. His reemergence would do more than expose them, it would annihilate the fragile structures of lies they had worked so hard to protect. The fallout would not simply be scandalous, it would be catastrophic. Ava's reputation, already teetering on the edge, would be obliterated. Alexis's carefully maintained image as a woman of integrity would shatter under the weight of her complicity. Christina, still young and vulnerable, would find herself condemned as someone who had participated in a crime too heavy for her conscience to bear. And in the center of it all stood Elizabeth Baldwin, a woman who had never sought power but had stumbled into it by virtue of a single, fateful decision. By rescuing Rick, she had become the keeper of the most dangerous truth in town. That truth gave her influence, leverage, and a kind of silent authority she had never experienced before. She could decide when and how Rick would return, and in doing so, she controlled the fates of all those entangled in this secret. It was a role she had never imagined for herself, a role she had never wanted, but one she could no longer escape. The deeper she went, the clearer it became that she was no longer just protecting Rick, she was orchestrating the game itself. This placed Elizabeth in a perilous position, for the very power she wielded also tethered her to the consequences. Each time she hinted to Ava that she knew too much, each time she allowed the lie of Rick's death to linger, she drew herself further into a world of manipulation and deceit. The nurse who once healed others was now balancing on a knife's edge, becoming both protector and manipulator, savior and destroyer. If Rick chose silence, Elizabeth would bear the guilt of watching Molly and the Lansing Davis family live in mourning, their grief forever a scar of her secrecy. If Rick chose vengeance, Elizabeth would find herself tied to an explosion of violence and chaos she could not contain. Rick himself embodied unpredictability. He was both victim and executioner, both man and myth. To the people of Port Charles, he was dead, yet his heartbeat pulsed in the shadows, waiting to erupt into the light. That contradiction alone made him the most dangerous man alive. Ava's empire of manipulation would crumble the moment she saw him standing in front of her. Alexis would no longer be able to shield herself behind excuses. Christina's fragile sense of identity would collapse under the weight of guilt. Even Molly, innocent in her mourning, would feel betrayed by Elizabeth for keeping the truth from her. The destruction would be total, cutting across relationships, alliances, and families. The bomb was ticking, and no one could stop it. The only question was who would light the fuse. Would Rick, driven by fury, unleash his wrath with no regard for the collateral damage? Or would Elizabeth, with her quiet strength and cautious control, manage to contain him long enough to prevent catastrophe? Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain: Rick Lansing's survival was not simply a twist in the story, it was the story. His return, whether as a ghost of vengeance or a man seeking redemption, would forever alter the landscape of Port Charles. And Elizabeth, once only a healer in a city of broken souls, was now the unlikely architect of its next great upheaval. She had not chosen this role, but by saving Rick, she had become a player in a dangerous game of power, secrets, and destruction. Whether she emerged as a savior or as the harbinger of ruin would depend not just on Rick's choices, but on her own ability to navigate the perilous web she herself had spun.